There's a boy sitting in the rain beside a guardrail on a mountain road, and nobody sees him. Not the paramedics working the wreckage 30 feet away, not the highway patrol officers drawing chalk lines around broken glass, not the news van that slowed, filmed the crushed sedan, and kept driving. The boy sits with his knees pulled to his chest and his eyes fixed on something that no longer exists, and the world moves around him the way rivers move around stones, without acknowledgement, without pause, without guilt. His face is streaked with blood that the rain has thinned to pink. He doesn't cry. He doesn't call for anyone. He simply breathes, each exhale visible in the cold mountain air, each inhale another small act of survival he doesn't even know he's performing. Then a single headlight cuts through the dark, and everything changes. If you've never watched a broken child choose to trust a scarred man on a motorcycle, you're about to. Stay until the end, because this story doesn't go where you think it does. If this one moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in this world you're watching from tonight. The charity run had ended at dusk. 47 motorcycles had rolled out of the Millhaven Veterans Center parking lot at 8 that morning, 2 columns of chrome and leather moving through fog-draped hills like a slow, deliberate funeral procession, except there was nothing funereal about it. There was laughter. There was the particular sound of aging men and women who had seen enough of the world's darkness to understand that joy, when it arrived, needed to be honored loud. There were flags mounted to sissy bars, not the kind governments hand out at ceremonies, but the kind riders sew themselves, brotherhood insignia, memorial patches, the names of people who used to ride in the column and now existed only in the spaces between engines. Grayson Mercer had led the run, as he'd led it for 11 consecutive years. He rode point not because it was glamorous, it wasn't, but because nobody else wanted the weight of it. Leading meant watching every mirror. Leading meant being the one who pulled over when someone's bike threw a chain on a mountain curve, who stood in traffic holding a flare while everyone else got to keep moving. Leading meant arriving last at the rest stops and leaving first, refilling your own coffee from someone else's thermos, and drinking it cold because there was never enough time. Grayson Mercer had been doing thankless things his entire adult life. The run was just another version of a habit he'd formed somewhere between his first deployment and his second divorce. He was 46 years old, and he looked every year of it. Not ugly. That wasn't the right word. His face was the kind that told stories before he opened his mouth, a topography of decisions made under pressure and scars earned honestly. A ridge along his left jaw where a bottle had caught him in a bar fight he hadn't started at 23. A faint parallel track above his right eyebrow where shrapnel had kissed him and moved on during his second tour, leaving its calling card like a signature. His hair had gone iron gray at his temples sometime in his late 30s, and he'd never bothered to care about it. His eyes were the color of the sky just before a thunderstorm. Not black, not blue, but that particular shade of gray that made people unconsciously lower their voices when he looked at them. He wore a leather cut the color of old motor oil, the Iron Shepherd MC patch on the back, so faded it looked like it had been rained on 1,000 times, because it had been. The run had gone well. 47 bikes in, 47 bikes out. They'd raised enough for the Veterans Transitional Housing Fund to cover 3 months of deposits. Grayson had shaken hands, accepted a plaque he'd already decided to leave on the table in the Veterans Center break room because he didn't display things like that, and then quietly peeled away from the closing celebration at the diner before anyone could make a speech about him. He didn't like speeches about himself. He never had. He took the mountain route home because it was longer, and because longer meant more time with just the engine and the road before he had to return to the specific silence of an empty house. Route 9 wound through the Cradle Ridge Hills like a river that couldn't commit to a direction, all hairpin curves and sudden drops on one side where the tree line ended and the valley opened up 600 feet below. At night, in wet weather, it was the kind of road that required everything you had. Grayson rode it with the particular focus of a man who'd learned the hard way that inattention had consequences. The rain had stopped 30 minutes ago. The road was still slick, black and sheened like polished obsidian under his headlight, steam rising from the asphalt in thin curling columns where the heat of the day was bleeding out. He came around a long right-hand curve and saw the lights before he registered what they were, red and blue, strobing through the mist, washing the tree line in alternating colors, painting the wet road in frantic rhythms that had nothing to do with calm. He slowed. Two highway patrol cruisers, an ambulance with its rear doors open, a fire department rescue unit parked at an angle that blocked the southbound lane completely. And beyond all of it, tucked against the guardrail on the far right shoulder, the accordion shape of a dark blue sedan that had found the barrier at speed and lost the argument badly. The front end was gone. Not damaged, gone. The engine had been pushed back through the firewall by the physics of impact, and whatever had been in that car's forward compartment no longer existed in any recognizable form. Grayson pulled to the shoulder 50 yards back from the perimeter and killed his engine. A trooper materialized out of the red-blue chaos almost immediately, hand raised, face carrying the flat exhaustion of someone who'd already had a long night and was adding to it. "Sir, this road is closed. You'll need to turn around and take the detour at mile marker." "What happened?" Grayson asked. "Single vehicle accident. Please turn your bike." "How long ago?" The trooper's jaw tightened. "Sir." "I'm not arguing with you," Grayson said, and kept his voice at the particular register he'd learned made people feel like they were being spoken to by someone who had seen worse than whatever they were currently managing. "I'm asking because I've been on this road for 40 minutes and I didn't pass anyone going the other way. Means whatever happened here happened before I came up from the valley." The trooper said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, "Little over 2 hours ago." Grayson nodded. He looked past the trooper at the scene, and he did what he always did in situations that felt wrong. He stopped looking at the thing everyone was looking at and started looking at everything else. The paramedics were crouched near the driver's side of the wreck. One was writing on a clipboard. That told him the driver wasn't being worked on anymore. The fire crew was doing post-incident standby, leaning against their rig with the particular posture of people who had done what they came to do and were now waiting to be released. Two troopers were at the front of the wreck taking measurements, standard accident reconstruction protocol. They were all concentrated in a roughly 40-foot radius centered on the crushed vehicle. Nobody was looking at the guardrail. Nobody was looking at the section of barrier 30 feet south of the wreck, where the mountain road curved away and the light from the emergency vehicles dropped off into shadow. Grayson looked there, and in that shadow, just visible, a shape. Small. Motionless. He said nothing to the trooper. He simply walked. The trooper called after him twice, the second time sharper, and Grayson kept walking because there was a shape in that shadow, and his gut had been telling him things for 23 years, and it had been right more often than it had been wrong. He crossed the shoulder gravel, and the shape resolved itself as he drew closer. A child sitting with his back against the guardrail, knees drawn up to his chest, both arms wrapped around his shins, chin lowered. A boy. Young, 8, 9, 10 at most, wearing a light gray hoodie and dark jeans, both soaked through. His sneakers were wet enough that water seeped out when Grayson saw him shift his weight slightly. The boy's face was streaked with what the rain had tried to clean but hadn't quite managed. Blood, thin to rust pink, tracing lines down from a cut above his hairline. His eyes were open. He was staring at the road in front of him with an expression that wasn't fear exactly. It was further than fear. Fear was a response to something happening. This was what existed on the other side of that, the place a person arrived at after the fear had already burned through all its fuel and left only ash. Grayson crouched down about 6 feet away. Not close. He'd learned a long time ago that proximity was a choice you gave someone, not a thing you took. "Hey," he said. The boy's eyes moved to him, slowly, like a machine that had been running on minimal power suddenly being asked to perform a task. "Hey," Grayson said again, softer. "You cold?" The boy looked at him, didn't speak. "That's okay," Grayson said. "You don't have to talk." He stayed crouched. His knees protested. The left one always did in cold weather. A parting gift from a roadside incident outside of Kandahar that the VA had classified as a soft tissue injury, and Grayson had classified as evidence that the universe had a mean sense of humor. He ignored it. Behind him, he could hear the trooper catching up, footsteps fast and purposeful on the gravel. "What the hell?" the trooper started. "There's a kid here," Grayson said without turning around. Silence. Then the trooper was beside him, flashlight swinging down to the boy, and Grayson heard the sharp intake of breath that meant the trooper hadn't known, hadn't seen, had been standing 50 feet from a child sitting in the dark and cold for how long? 2 hours? More? Son, the trooper said, voice shifting registers entirely, losing its official edge and going somewhere human instead. Son, my name is Officer Delacroix. Are you hurt? The boy didn't respond. Can you tell me your name? Nothing. Grayson watched the child's eyes. They'd moved to the trooper briefly and then moved back. To Grayson. Settled there. Not trusting, exactly. But not leaving either, the way a wild animal in pain sometimes locked onto one particular person in a crowd and made a decision about them. He was in the car, Grayson said quietly. We didn't see. The trooper stopped, recalibrated. We searched the vehicle. Passenger compartment? The driver's side was the primary. Another stop. Grayson could hear the man doing the math in his head, the sick arithmetic of a scene re-examined. There were no child seats visible, no indication of, he walked here on his own, Grayson said. After, probably before you arrived. He kept his eyes on the boy. How long were you sitting here before the lights came? He asked the child. No answer, but something moved in the boy's face. Not recognition, not response. More like the question had reached a room that was currently empty. Does he need immediate medical? The trooper began. Get the paramedics, Grayson said, and get something warm. He stayed crouched. His left knee screamed. He stayed anyway. The next 20 minutes happened in the particular chaos that emergency scenes produced when a complication discovered itself mid-process. Voices, radio chatter, a paramedic with a foil emergency blanket, and practiced hands who found the cut on the boy's scalp and said words like laceration and pupil response and mild concussion in a measured tone that was somehow both professional and quietly horrified. The boy allowed himself to be examined. He didn't resist. He didn't assist. He was perfectly, completely passive, the way people became when the decision-making part of themselves had temporarily disconnected from the control board. Throughout all of it, his eyes kept returning to Grayson, not to the paramedic, not to Officer Delacroix, who was now on his radio with a voice gone tight and careful, not to the second trooper who'd arrived and was documenting the guardrail, the footprints, the small wet indentations in the gravel that told the story of a child who had crawled away from a wreck in the dark and found the first solid thing he could put his back against and simply stopped moving. To Grayson. Every time. And Grayson, who had not planned on being on this road at this hour, who had planned on being home by 9 with a sandwich and whatever game was on the television as background noise, while he sat alone in a house that had been too quiet for 4 years, stayed exactly where he was. He didn't touch the boy. He didn't crowd him. He simply remained. A fixed point in a scene that had too many moving parts. Can you tell me your name? The paramedic asked the boy. Gentle, professional. The boy said nothing. Do you know where you live? Nothing. What's your mom's name, your dad's? Something happened then. Something small and terrible. The boy's jaw tightened for just a moment. A single brief muscular event that lasted less than a second before his face went smooth and distant again. But Grayson caught it. He caught it the way you caught things when you'd spent enough time in situations where small signals were the only signals that mattered. He filed it away. Retrograde amnesia is possible with a head injury of this severity, the paramedic said to Delacroix, voice low. Or he's in shock. Or both. We need to transport him, get him scanned. Can you reach family? No ID on him, the second trooper said. No phone, no backpack. We're running the vehicle, but the plates are... A pause. The front-end impact destroyed the plate. We're cross-referencing VIN. How long on that? Could be hours. The database is... Get him to Cradle Ridge Medical, Delacroix said. I'll follow. They reached for the boy then, carefully, professionally, two people who did this for a living and did it correctly. And the boy moved. Not away from them, but he turned his head and looked directly at Grayson with an expression that Grayson would spend months trying to accurately describe to people who asked. And the closest he would ever get was this. It was the look of someone standing at the edge of an enormous height who has identified the one person in the crowd they believe might catch them, asking without words whether that person intends to walk away. I'm not going anywhere, Grayson said. To the boy? Not to the paramedics or the troopers. To the boy. The boy let them lift him. Grayson followed the ambulance to Cradle Ridge Medical on his motorcycle, his headlight filling the ambulance's back window with a steady amber glow through the dark mountain curves. He didn't think too hard about why. He'd learned in his 40s to stop interrogating instincts that had never gotten him killed and start trusting them the way he'd learned to trust his bike on a road he'd never ridden, carefully, attentively, with full commitment once the decision was made. The hospital emergency department at 11:30 on a Wednesday night was the particular variety of fluorescent-lit despair that Grayson associated with institutions that served everyone because they had no choice. Cracked plastic chairs in colors that had once been cheerful, a television bolted to the wall, cycling news with the sound muted, a triage nurse whose efficiency was its own form of compassion. They took the boy through the doors, and Grayson stopped at the desk. "I was with him at the scene," he said. "I'd like to stay." The triage nurse looked at him, leather jacket, road gray hair, Iron Shepherd MC patch. "Are you family?" "No." "Then I can't—" "Is there someone else?" Grayson asked. "Family? Someone who's coming?" The nurse's expression answered before she did. "No, not yet. Possibly not at all, depending on what the VIN search turned up." "Then he's alone in there," Grayson said. Not an argument, a statement. The nurse looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up a phone and made a call. Grayson sat in one of the cracked plastic chairs and waited. He got coffee from the machine in the hallway, something that shared a chemical relationship with coffee without committing to the full experience, and drank it standing up because sitting still had always been harder than moving. Delacroix arrived 20 minutes later, hat under his arm, looking like a man who'd had a bad night and had just realized it was going to get worse. "Vin came back," the trooper said, sitting beside where Grayson eventually planted himself. "Vehicle registered to a Caleb Brooks, out-of-state plates, Kansas registration. We're reaching out to Kansas records now." "Kansas," Grayson repeated. "Long way from home." Delacroix rubbed the back of his neck. "No criminal record, nothing on file. We're trying to locate family." A pause. "If there's a mother, a relative, someone should know there's a child. Someone should be looking." "Someone should have been looking 2 hours ago," Grayson said. Delacroix didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that didn't implicate the entire scene. A doctor came out at 1 a.m, young, tired, carrying a tablet she wasn't looking at. "He's stable," she said. "The laceration was superficial. Looks worse than it is. Scalp wounds bleed dramatically. We did a CT, no significant intracranial trauma. He's dehydrated, hypothermic, and has what appears to be significant psychological shock." A beat. "He still hasn't spoken." "Is that neurological?" Delacroix asked. "Possibly partially. The concussion could be contributing, but in my clinical assessment—" She paused, choosing words with the care of someone who knew how they'd land. "He knows where he is. He's tracking conversation. He's choosing not to speak. That's trauma presentation, not brain injury." She looked at Grayson. "He asked for you." "How?" Delacroix said. "If he's not speaking—" "He pointed," she said. "When I asked if there was anyone he wanted in the room, he pointed at the door and then—" She almost smiled. "He looked at the window. There's a motorcycle in the parking lot that's visible from his bed." Grayson stood up. He sat with the boy for 2 hours. The room was small and very white. The machines beeped in steady rhythms that became background noise after the first 10 minutes. And outside the window, the parking lot security lamp cast an amber pool over his Harley, where it sat alone in the otherwise empty lot. The boy was propped up in the bed with a bandage at his hairline and an IV line in his left arm, and the kind of hospital gown that was designed to be functional and managed only to be humiliating. He was watching Grayson with those storm gray eyes, a color, Grayson noticed, not entirely different from his own. "You don't have to know who you are right now," Grayson said, somewhere around 2 a.m. "That's okay. We can figure that out later." The boy looked at him. "But if you're scared," Grayson said, "you can just say that." A very long pause. The machines beeped. Outside, a car moved through the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling in a slow arc. Then, so quietly that Grayson wasn't entirely certain he'd heard it at all, a single word. "Yeah." Grayson nodded once. "Okay," he said. "Me too, sometimes." He didn't push for more. He'd learned the hard way that pushing people toward language before they were ready only drove them further from it. Instead, he sat with his elbows on his knees and let the room be quiet. And the boy's breathing gradually slowed from the shallow, rapid rhythm of someone barely holding on to something deeper and more regular. And around 3 a.m, Grayson realized the kid had fallen asleep while watching him, and was still watching him even now, eyes half closed, his small chest rising and falling with the particular rhythm of exhaustion finally winning. The morning brought complications. Delacroix arrived at 7 with a coffee he actually handed to Grayson and a face that said the night had not produced the answers it was supposed to. "Kansas reached back," he said, stepping into the hallway outside the room. "Caleb Brooks, 34 years old," and a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "A wife, Lydia Brooks, 32. We're trying to reach next of kin." "Trying," Grayson said. "The Brooks family doesn't appear to have extensive local roots in Kansas. They were traveling. We think they might have been—" Delacroix stopped again. He was a man who was working up to something. "Grayson, we don't know yet what happened to the driver. The injuries were—" He chose his next word with surgical care. "Significant." The silence between them held everything that word implied. "And the boy," Grayson said. "Still no match on any missing persons report. If they were traveling, if nobody knew their route—" He spread his hands. "It takes time. We'll find family. It just might take—" "Time," Grayson said. "Yes." "And until then?" Delacroix's expression shifted into the specific territory of institutional apology, the look of a system acknowledging its own limitations, while the person in front of it bore the practical consequences. "There's a foster placement process, emergency placement. We'd need to contact—" "On a Thursday morning," Grayson said. "The coordinator doesn't—" "What time does the coordinator start?" 9. "What happens to him between now and 9? The trooper had no answer, because the answer was the hospital, which was functional and clean and staffed by people doing their jobs correctly, and which was about as emotionally equipped for a traumatized child who wasn't speaking as a parking garage was for a thunderstorm. When Grayson walked back into the room, the boy was awake, sitting up, watching the door like he'd known Grayson was coming back through it and had been waiting to confirm it. There was a breakfast tray on the rolling table beside the bed, untouched, scrambled eggs going cold, a carton of orange juice with the straw still in its wrapper. "You should eat something," Grayson said, settling back into the chair. The boy looked at the tray, then at Grayson. Then, slowly, he reached out and picked up the orange juice and pulled the straw wrapper off with focused precision, inserted the straw, and drank. He didn't touch the eggs. "Fair enough," Grayson said. The foster system coordinator called at 9:14. Grayson heard the hospital social worker taking the call in the hallway, her voice dropping at intervals in the way that voices did when the news being transmitted was disappointing. He didn't need to hear the specifics. The specifics were predictable. The available placement list, the process that took hours, the fact that a child with an unconfirmed identity presented unique complications. There were protocols. There were regulations. The regulations existed for good reasons and also, incidentally, left a 9-year-old boy, maybe 10, they still didn't know, sitting in a hospital room with a cooling plate of eggs and a man on a motorcycle who had no claim to him whatsoever. The social worker came in at 9:45. Her name was Patricia Voss, and she had the kind of professional warmth that you developed after enough years of doing a job that required you to care deeply and continuously in institutional conditions that didn't naturally support it. She spoke to the boy gently, clearly, using simple language and a calm voice, and the boy sat in his hospital bed and watched her and said absolutely nothing. She documented this with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom silence from traumatized children was not an anomaly. When she spoke to Grayson in the hallway, her voice was honest. "We have no confirmed identity, no family contact yet. The emergency placement network has one available foster family in the county right now, and they have 4 children already in the home." A pause. He's fragile. I'd like to find a quieter placement. How long does that take? Could be today, could be tomorrow. And until then, he stays here, she said. The hospital can... He needs to go somewhere that doesn't feel like a hospital, Grayson said. Voss looked at him. She'd been doing this long enough to recognize when civilians understood something the system's infrastructure was too blunt to address. Mr. Mercer, she said carefully, you're not a licensed foster placement. No, he agreed. There would be a significant vetting process before we could authorize... How long? Days, minimum. Background check, home assessment. I have a clean record, Grayson said. 11 years of veterans advocacy work. I've had state contractors through my shop and my property for the charity-run organization without incident. I'm assuming your database would confirm that within a few hours. She looked at him steadily. You want to take this boy? I want him to be somewhere that isn't a hospital bed waiting on a form. He kept his voice level. I'm suggesting you run whatever check you need to run, and that while you run it, the boy sits somewhere that has less fluorescent lighting. Patricia Voss was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Let me make some calls. The clearance took 4 hours. Grayson spent them in the chair beside the bed, and the boy spent them watching him with the focused attention of someone learning a language they'd never been taught. Around noon, the boy reached for the orange juice a second time. The carton was empty, so he squeezed it flat methodically, studying the way the cardboard compressed, then set it precisely back on the tray. His hands were dexterous in a way that caught Grayson's attention. Careful, deliberate. The hands of someone who'd been taught to pay attention to how things worked. You like figuring out how things fit together, Grayson said. The boy looked at him, said nothing, but he didn't look away either. I've got a garage, Grayson said. Not right now, don't worry about that. But sometime, if you want to see how an engine works, I could show you. Something. Not a smile. Nothing that dramatic, but a very slight adjustment in the set of the boy's expression, a micro-movement in the muscles around his eyes that said the information had landed somewhere it mattered. Grayson stored that away too. Patricia Voss came back at 2 in the afternoon with paperwork and a cleared temporary placement authorization that was good for 72 hours, renewable. She explained the terms to Grayson in clinical language, and then she crouched down to the boy's level and explained it differently. That he was going to stay with Mr. Mercer for a little while, that Mr. Mercer had a house and a safe place, that someone would be checking in regularly, and that he could tell anyone at any time if he felt unsafe. She watched the boy's face carefully as she spoke. The boy turned and looked at Grayson. Grayson gave him nothing. No reassurance, no smile, no performance of trustworthiness. He just met the look straight on, the way you met a road, with full attention and no pretense. The boy nodded. Once. Small. Voss caught Grayson's eye over the boy's head, and something passed between them. Not approval exactly, but recognition. She'd been doing this long enough to know when a child was making a real choice versus a compliant one. They left the hospital at 3. The boy walked out on his own legs, which he'd been doing since the moment the IV came out. No suggestion of needing assistance, no lingering, just a clean stand and a forward movement that suggested he was not someone who liked being still longer than circumstances required. Someone had found him dry clothes from the hospital's donation closet. Jeans a size too big, a green hoodie, socks without shoes because his sneakers were still wet. He walked in just socks through the hospital parking lot without any visible self-consciousness. Grayson stopped at the Harley. He looked at the boy. You've been on a motorcycle before? The boy's brow furrowed slightly, thinking or trying to access something that wasn't easily accessible. Doesn't matter, Grayson said. You're safe. I'll go slow. He zip-tied his spare helmet to the passenger position. It was an old road helmet, too big, but it would do, and settled the boy on the bike behind him. Hold here, he said, placing the boy's hands on his sides. Don't let go, not for any reason, okay? The hands gripped. Firmly. Again. Those hands. The grip of someone who understood leverage intuitively. The Harley rumbled to life and the boy's hands tightened once, a single involuntary response, and then held steady. Grayson pulled out of the lot slowly, and he kept it slow all the way through Cradle Ridge and onto the county road toward home. And behind him, he could feel the small hands holding on and the small body adjusting its weight through the curves with a natural instinct that shouldn't have been there in a child who claimed, through silence, not to know anything about this world he'd somehow survived being ejected from. Grayson's house was a single-story structure on 2 acres at the end of a gravel road, the kind of property that looked like it had been added to over decades by someone who kept finding reasons to expand without ever quite getting around to finishing anything. An attached garage dominated the left side, its doors wide enough to take 3 bikes side by side. A covered porch ran along the front, a wooden swing hanging from it that swayed in the November wind. There were tools on the porch rail that someone had started cleaning and not finished. A coffee mug on the window ledge outside the front door that had been there long enough to have a ring. The boy stood on the gravel and looked at it. "Not fancy," Grayson said. The boy looked at the garage door. "That's where I work on bikes," Grayson said. "And you're not going in there today. Today you eat something real and sleep somewhere flat." He made grilled cheese on the range, 2 sandwiches slightly burned on one side because he'd been watching the boy instead of the pan. The boy sat at the kitchen table and ate both sandwiches without being asked to eat the second one, methodically and without waste, and drank a full glass of water and then another. Between bites, he looked around the kitchen with those measuring eyes, the hanging cast iron pan, the drawer handle that needed tightening, the clock on the wall that was running 3 minutes slow. After he ate, Grayson showed him the spare room. Plain. A bed with a green blanket, a wooden dresser, a lamp. The window looked out on the garage. "Bathrooms across the hall," Grayson said. "There are towels, so—" He paused. "If you need something in the night, my room is the first door on the left. You don't have to knock, just come in." He turned to go. Behind him, very quietly, "Thank you." Grayson stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He gave it a second because some things deserved a second. Then he turned and looked at the boy, who was standing in the middle of the spare room in socks too big for him with his hands at his sides, looking back. "Yeah," Grayson said. "You're okay." He pulled the door almost closed and stood in the hallway for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, and the house settled around him in its particular way, and he listened to the sound of a child existing on the other side of a wall for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember. And he was honest enough with himself in that moment to acknowledge that the house sounded different with the boy in it. Not louder. Just less empty. Like a room that had been sealed for a long time and had someone finally crack a window. He called Delacroix from the porch. "Anything new on the Brooks family?" "We made contact with the next of kin in Kansas," the trooper said, and his voice carried something careful in it. "A sister, Naomi Brooks. She's—" A pause. "She's aware there was an accident. The details are still being—" He stopped. "It's complicated, Grayson." "Tell me." "The driver of the vehicle, Caleb Brooks." A longer pause this time. "He didn't make it. Crash injuries. He was declared at the scene, but in the chaos with the road closure and the rain—" Another stop. Grayson could hear the trooper working through something that was bothering him as a professional and as a human being simultaneously. His wife was a passenger, Lydia Brooks. The word came out quiet. She was pronounced at the hospital, both of them. Grayson stood on the porch in the November dark and listened to the wind moving through the bare branches of the 2 oak trees at the property's edge. "So the boy," Grayson said, "is the only survivor," Delacroix said. "Yes." The silence between them carried the weight of what that meant. A child who had survived something that claimed both of his parents, who had walked away from it into the dark, who had sat alone beside a guardrail in the rain while the world moved around him and nobody looked in the right direction, who had held on to the back of a stranger's motorcycle with those careful, deliberate hands and not let go. "What does Naomi Brooks know?" Grayson asked. "She knows there was a crash. She knows she has a nephew. She doesn't know—" Delacroix cleared his throat. "She doesn't know we found him yet. There were communication issues, databases, the timeline of—" He stopped. "It's a systemic failure, Grayson. The right hand and the left hand." "So she's been looking for a child she doesn't know is alive," Grayson said. "Yes. And the boy doesn't know what happened to his parents." "No. And I'm the one—" "Don't," Delacroix said quietly. Don't get ahead of it. We're coordinating with Kansas. We'll have clear information by tomorrow. A pause. He's safe where he is? Yes, Grayson said. Then let him be safe. One night. Tomorrow, we'll have more. Grayson hung up and stood on the porch for a long time. The wind picked up and the swing moved on its own, a slow arc that creaked at the top of each reach. From inside the house came no sounds at all. The boy was either asleep or sitting in the quiet with practiced efficiency, which told its own story. He went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and didn't do the thing he would normally do, which was pour 2 fingers of whiskey and let the night dissolve. Instead, he sat with his hands flat on the table and thought about a boy who could eat 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and notice a clock running 3 minutes slow and tell you everything you needed to know with his hands without saying a single word, and about a woman somewhere in Kansas who didn't know yet that the thing she was looking for had been found. He thought about what tomorrow was going to ask of him. His phone buzzed. Not Delacroix. The contact read Reed. Danny Reed, the Iron Shepherd. MC's sergeant-at-arms, who had been Grayson's road brother for 17 years, and who had an uncanny instinct for calling at moments when Grayson was sitting alone at tables thinking about difficult things. You made it back, Reed said. Thought you got lost on the mountain. Had a detour, Grayson said. A pause. Reed was good at pauses. He'd learned them the same place Grayson had. Years of situations where the wrong word too fast was worse than no word at all. What kind of detour? Grayson told him. Not everything, the shape of it. Reed listened without interrupting, which was how you knew he was paying real attention. When Grayson finished, Reed was quiet for a few seconds. Then, You've got him there now. Yeah. And tomorrow? Don't know yet. Another pause, shorter this time. You need anything? Not tonight. You call me, Reed said. Not a suggestion. Whatever it looks like tomorrow, you call me. Yeah, Grayson said. He sat for a while longer after he hung up, and then he got up and checked the spare room door. Still pulled almost closed, a line of dark at the gap. He listened. Breathing, slow and deep. The boy was asleep. He went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. He lay in the dark and listened to the house and the wind and the distant sound of a truck moving on the county road 1/2 mile away, and he thought about the boy's hands on his sides as they came through the mountain curves, the grip that didn't panic, that adjusted, that held on, and about the fact that someone who survived what this child had survived without making a sound afterward was carrying something that would eventually need to come out, and that when it came out, there needed to be somewhere for it to go. At 4 a.m, he heard the spare room door open. He didn't move. He stayed still and let his breathing stay even, the old practice flatness of a man who'd spent enough nights in places where you didn't signal consciousness before you understood what was moving toward you. Footsteps in the hall, small, careful. They stopped outside his door. A long pause. Then the footsteps moved again, not away. The door opened, just enough. Grayson turned his head. The boy stood in the doorway in the dark, green hoodie, 2 big socks, the bandage at his hairline a pale strip against his skin. He looked at Grayson for a moment. Then he looked at the floor by the bed. I don't... He stopped. His voice was rough from disuse, like a door opened after a long time. I don't know if I... He stopped again. You can stay, Grayson said. There's a blanket at the foot of the bed. The boy looked at him for another second. Then he crossed the room in 4 quiet steps, pulled the extra blanket from the foot of the bed, and folded himself onto the floor beside it with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before in some half-remembered life. He was asleep again within minutes. Grayson could tell by the breathing. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and understood, with the particular clarity that 4 a.m. sometimes delivered, that tomorrow was going to be harder than tonight. Because tomorrow, he was going to have to find out if Danny Reed could bring some of the brothers to the clubhouse. Not for muscle, not for intimidation, because in the morning, Patricia Voss was calling with a decision about the placement extension, and before she made that call, Grayson needed to know whether the Iron Shepherds were willing to be something for this boy that the system currently couldn't figure out how to be. And because there was something else, something he hadn't told Reed, hadn't told Voss, hadn't told Delacroix. When he'd crouched down beside the boy at the guardrail in the dark, in those first seconds before the trooper reached them, the boy had said something. So quiet it had been, nearly lost in the rain and the wind and the distant hiss of emergency radios. 2 words, barely breath, not directed at Grayson, but at the space in front of him, at whatever he'd been staring at before the headlight found him. He's gone. Not, I'm hurt. Not, I need help. Not, where am I? He's gone. And Grayson, who had been present for enough grief to recognize the specific register of it, had understood in that moment that the boy knew something he hadn't yet admitted to knowing. Something about the car. Something about the wreck. Something that had driven him to his feet in the dark and into the rain and up against a guardrail 30 feet away from a scene he couldn't bear to be part of. The question was not what he knew. The question was what happened when someone finally had to say it to him out loud. And that question was coming. Tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that. But it was coming the way winter came on that mountain road. Inevitable and cold. And when it arrived, Grayson Mercer was going to be the one sitting across from a 10-year-old boy with storm-gray eyes and careful hands and no name he was willing to claim, and he was going to have to find words for something that didn't have any. Outside, the wind picked up. The bare oaks creaked. On the floor beside his bed, the boy slept. And Grayson lay awake in the dark and understood, for the first time in a very long time, that he was afraid. The boy slept for 14 hours. When he woke, Danny Reed was already at the door, and he wasn't alone. Danny Reed arrived at 7:43 in the morning, which meant he'd been on the road before 6, which meant he'd been awake before that, which meant he hadn't slept much either. Grayson heard the pipe before he saw the headlight, that particular low throb of a softail running easy, not pushing, the sound of a man who knew where he was going and wasn't in a hurry to announce himself. He was already at the kitchen window with coffee when Reed came up the gravel, the November light still pale and flat, frost on the grass catching it like broken glass scattered across the yard. Reed cut the engine and sat for a moment before dismounting. He always did that. Sat with the bike after he killed it, like the transition from moving to still required a beat of acknowledgement. 17 years of watching the man do it, and Grayson still didn't know if it was habit or ritual or just the specific version of patience that Reed had developed after losing things he couldn't get back. He came up the porch steps, and Grayson opened the door before he could knock. Reed looked at him, took in the kitchen, the 2 coffee mugs, the faint sounds of the house. "He's still sleeping?" "Yeah." Reed stepped inside and accepted the mug Grayson handed him without asking. He was a big man, Reed, not tall, but wide across the shoulders in a way that made doorframes feel provisional. His gray-streaked beard trimmed close, his hands the kind that had built and broken things in roughly equal measure. He wore his cut over a flannel shirt, the iron shepherd patch facing the room like a statement. He looked around the kitchen with the careful eyes of a man assessing a situation. "You look terrible," Reed said. "Didn't sleep." "No." He drank. "How bad is it?" Grayson sat at the table. He told Reed the rest of it, the part he hadn't told him on the phone. The 2 words at the guardrail. He's gone. What Delacroix had confirmed about Caleb and Lydia Brooks. The boy on the floor at 4 in the morning with a blanket and no name he'd claim out loud. Reed listened with his mug in both hands and his eyes on the table. When Grayson finished, Reed was quiet for long enough that the refrigerator cycled on and off in the silence. "He knows," Reed said. "He knows something." That's different from knowing something and letting it be real. Reed looked up. He walked away from the car before the scene was processed. Before anyone told him anything, he was making a decision. About what? About how much reality he could carry at one time. Reed set his mug down. "I've seen that before." Grayson had too. They didn't need to name where. "Voss calls at 9, Grayson said. "And?" "I need to know if the brothers will show up. Not today. Today I'm not asking anything. But if this goes longer than 72 hours, if the placement extension holds, if the ant can't get here fast." He paused. "He can't be in this house alone with me indefinitely. That's not—" He stopped, found the right word. That's not enough for what he needs. Reed looked at him for a long moment. You're not asking me if the brothers will show up, he said. You're asking me if they'll be okay with it. Are they? Reed stood and walked to the window, stood with his back to the room, looking out at the gravel where his bike sat. Outside, a crow landed on the porch rail and regarded the yard with the lateral suspicion of its kind. Brewster will have something to say, Reed said. Brewster has something to say about everything. He's not wrong that this is outside what we do. We do veterans housing advocacy. We do charity runs. We do funeral escorts for people who die alone, Grayson said. Since when do we have a definition of what we do? Reed turned from the window. His expression was not disagreement. It was something more complicated. The face of a man who was working out the architecture of a decision that would affect people he was responsible for. I'll make calls, he said. I'll talk to Brewster myself. A pause. But Grayson, if this boy has an aunt who's coming, if there's family, I know. You can't. I know, Grayson said again, harder this time. Reed looked at him, said nothing, which was its own form of saying something. From the hallway came the sound of small feet on the wooden floor. Both men turned. The boy appeared in the kitchen doorway in the green hoodie and oversized socks, the bandage at his hairline slightly askew from sleep, his hair pressed flat on one side. He looked at Grayson, then at Reed. His eyes moved over Reed the way they'd moved over everything else, measuring, taking inventory, assigning values to what he saw. Reed, to his credit, didn't do anything performative. He didn't crouch down, didn't make his voice soft, didn't produce the particular expression adults manufactured for children when they were trying to seem safe. He just looked at the boy and gave him a single nod, the kind you gave someone at a rest stop or at the counter of a place you'd been before. Acknowledgement without agenda. The boy looked at Reed's cut, at the iron shepherd patch. Then he walked to the table and sat down in the chair he'd used the night before, and looked at Grayson. And Grayson got up and made toast. Reed watched this without comment. He finished his coffee standing at the counter and set the mug in the sink and said, I'll call you after I talk to Brewster. And Grayson said, yeah. And Reed let himself out the back and the Softail fired up outside, and the boy watched the kitchen window until the sound of it faded down the gravel road. That's Danny Reed, Grayson said. He's my road brother. You'll see him again. The boy looked at the toast Grayson set in front of him, picked it up, ate it with the same methodical focus he brought to everything. When he was done, he put the plate precisely in the center of the table and looked up. What's my name? He asked. The question arrived so cleanly, so directly, that Grayson's first instinct was to look away. He didn't. He held the boy's gaze and said, We're still working on that. You don't know? We know some things, Grayson said carefully. We're trying to confirm them. The boy processed this. His jaw moved slightly, a small chewing motion with nothing in his mouth, the physical habit of someone working through information. But you know something. Yes. Tell me. Grayson sat. He set his coffee mug down. He was quiet for a moment, not because he was stalling, but because what he was about to say to a 10-year-old child deserved to be assembled correctly. Your last name is Brooks, he said. That much we're sure of. The boy sat very still. Brooks, he said. Not a question. Testing the sound of it, turning it over. Does that? Grayson started. It doesn't feel like anything, the boy said. The honesty in it was absolute. The flat reportage of someone describing a physical symptom. I hear it, and there's just... He stopped, made a small, frustrated motion with his hands, a brief gesture that died quickly. Nothing. That's okay, Grayson said. Is it? The doctor said that can happen after a head injury. It doesn't mean it's gone. It means it's... He searched. Inaccessible. Right now. The boy looked at him steadily. He had the focused attention of someone who was good at detecting when they were being managed. What's my first name? We're not certain yet. But you have a guess. Grayson looked at him. Ethan, he said. We think Ethan. The boy said it silently, just the mouth shape of it, no sound. Once. Then again. Ethan Brooks, he said out loud, quietly. Then he picked up his empty plate and carried it to the sink with the particular deliberateness of someone who'd been taught to clean up after themselves, rinsed it, set it in the drying rack, and stood looking out the kitchen window at the frost-pale yard. "Okay," he said. "Just that. Okay. Not that's me. Not I remember. Just okay." A word that meant he was taking in information and deciding how much of it to let himself believe. Patricia Voss called at 9:07. She confirmed the 72-hour extension with careful professional language and told Grayson that contact had been established with Naomi Brooks in Kansas, that Naomi was, and Voss paused here with the tact of someone navigating between necessary information and devastating information, processing the situation, and had indicated intent to travel as soon as arrangements could be made. She didn't say what arrangements. She didn't specify what Naomi was processing. Grayson had a clear enough picture. "She's coming," Voss said. "I don't have a timeline yet. Days at minimum." "He needs more than this house," Grayson said. "I understand. What are you suggesting?" "I have a clubhouse. The Iron Shepherd MC has a clubhouse. It's a converted building 12 miles out. My brothers are there most days. It's not—" He stopped, knowing exactly how it sounded. "It's not what it sounds like." The silence on Voss's end lasted 3 full seconds. "Mr. Mercer." "I know. The optics of taking a child in emergency placement to a motorcycle club are bad," he said. "I know, but the optics of leaving him in a house alone with one man who doesn't know what he's doing are worse. He needs people. He needs normal, whatever normal looks like for the next few days." He kept his voice level. "I'm not asking you to approve it. I'm asking you to think about whether the alternative serves him better." Another silence. Then, "I'll need to make a site visit before I can authorize anything outside your residence." "Today?" "This afternoon," she said, "if you can make that happen." He could. He called Reed after he hung up and said 4 words. "Get the place clean." Reed said, "Already on it." The Iron Shepherd MC Clubhouse sat at the end of a county road that had been paved sometime in the 80s and had been slowly reclaiming its original nature ever since. It occupied what had been, in order, a grain cooperative storage facility in the 40s, a failed roadhouse in the 70s, and a gutted shell that Grayson and 11 other veterans had purchased for back taxes in 2009 and spent 18 months converting into something habitable by people who didn't need much to be comfortable but needed what they did have to be real. It was large, 3,000 square feet of open floor that had been divided into a main common room, a kitchen, 2 bathrooms, a back room used variously for storage and meetings, and a garage bay attached to the east side that could take 4 bikes out of the weather. The walls were original timber, dark with age and smoke, hung with Iron Shepherd memorabilia, veteran insignia, maps of routes they'd ridden, photographs of faces, some of which no longer had living owners. There was a long bar along the north wall that served coffee and did not serve alcohol during business hours, a point Grayson had insisted on from the beginning, and that had caused exactly the argument Reed had predicted, and that had stayed. A jukebox in the corner that had needed its capacitors replaced twice and its needle once, and that played a mix of country, classic rock, and blues that nobody had ever bothered to curate beyond the gradual addition of quarters over 15 years. Wooden floors worn smooth by boots, 3 ceiling fans that wobbled slightly and had never fallen. Fluorescent lighting replaced years ago by hanging industrial pennants that cast the room in something warm enough to actually sit under. When Grayson arrived with the boy at 11 that morning, Reed had already been there 2 hours. The floor had been swept, the bar had been wiped down. The ashtrays, a point of some contention, had been removed from the main room and relocated to the back room. Someone had made a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint and left it on the warmer. The jukebox was playing Johnny Cash at a volume that filled the room without dominating it. 3 of the brothers were there. Reed, Marcus Hale, who was 61 years old and had been riding since he was 16, and who worked, in his non-riding life, as a middle school shop teacher, and who had never in 17 years of membership mentioned this fact to anyone who might find it ironic. And Terry Van, who was the only woman in the Iron Shepherds, and who had been riding longer than either of them, and who carried herself with the specific gravity of someone who had decided several decades ago exactly which battles were worth fighting and had been correct in every selection since. The boy walked into the clubhouse and stopped just inside the door. He looked at the room, at the bikes visible through the open garage bay door, at the walls and the photographs and the jukebox that was currently between songs, at Marcus, who was at the bar with both hands around a coffee mug, and who met the boy's eyes and said, without inflection, "Coffee's hot." At Terry, who was at a workbench on the far side of the room doing something with a carburetor, and who didn't look up at all, just said, "Don't touch anything on this bench." The boy looked at Grayson. "You're fine," Grayson said. The boy walked in. He moved through the room the way he moved through everything, with his eyes doing the real work, cataloging, assessing. He stopped at the jukebox when it started a new song, looked at it. Then he reached up and put his palm flat against the cabinet, feeling the vibration of the speaker. Nobody said anything. After a moment, the boy took his hand away and kept moving. He looked at the photographs on the walls, at the bikes in the garage bay, a row of iron, chrome in the dim light, each one distinct. He stood in the garage doorway for a long time, long enough that Grayson came to stand beside him. "That one's got a carburetor issue," the boy said quietly. Grayson looked at the bike he was looking at, a '94 Road King that belonged to a brother named Charlie Pine, who hadn't been able to make it this morning and who had in fact been complaining about idle instability for 3 weeks. "How can you tell?" The boy shrugged. "The way it smells. It's running too rich. You can tell from the exhaust residue around the pipe." He said it the way you said something you were certain of but didn't want to oversell, matter-of-factly, slightly away from the topic, like the information had just arrived from somewhere else and he was passing it along. Grayson stared at him. "I don't know how I know that," the boy said before Grayson could ask. "I wasn't going to ask," Grayson said. "You were thinking it." "Yeah," Grayson said. "I was." Marcus appeared in the garage doorway beside them, refilling his mug from a thermos. He looked at the Road King. "You think it's the carb?" "The needle's probably set too rich," the boy said. "Or the float stuck." Marcus looked at the boy for a long moment, not skeptical, just taking a reading. "You want to look at it?" The boy glanced at Grayson. "Go ahead," Grayson said. What happened over the next 40 minutes was something that Grayson would describe to Reed later that night, with the careful understatement of a man who didn't trust himself to convey it accurately. The boy looked at the carburetor, and Marcus handed him tools when he asked for them, and the boy's hands moved through the engine with the precision of someone navigating by memory they couldn't consciously access. And he found the float, stuck, exactly as he'd said. And Marcus watched with his arms crossed, and an expression that was doing its level best not to show what it was showing, and when the boy sat back on his heels and said, "Try it now," Marcus kicked the bike over and it idled clean and even, and Marcus said, "Huh," and that was the entire response, and somehow it was exactly right. Terry Van appeared in the garage doorway, looked at the bike, looked at the boy. "How old are you?" "I don't know exactly," the boy said. Terry considered this. "What's your name?" "Mason," he said. Grayson looked at him. That wasn't a name they'd discussed. That wasn't a name from the Brooks family records. He waited. "That's what I want to be called," the boy said. "For now." He looked at the bike. "Mason." Terry nodded. No elaboration, no explanation requested. "All right, Mason," she said, and went back to her carburetor. Patricia Voss arrived at 2 in the afternoon and walked through the clubhouse with the systematic attention of someone who had learned not to let surfaces deceive her. She looked at the floors, the kitchen, the bathroom, the back room, the garage. She spoke briefly to Marcus and to Reed and to Terry, asking quiet questions and receiving quiet answers. She watched Mason, who had by this point been given a corner of Marcus's workbench and a disassembled antique clock that Marcus had been meaning to get to for approximately 3 years, for a long time without approaching him. When she came to stand beside Grayson near the bar, her voice was very even. "He seems comfortable." "Yes." "You understand the documentation this requires." "Tell me what you need." "Daily check-ins, minimum. My office has to be reachable. If his status changes, if family contact changes, I need to know before he does." She paused. "And if anything changes here, any incident, Nothing's going to happen to him here," Grayson said. She looked at him steadily. That's not something you can promise. Watch me, he said. The expression that crossed her face was not one she'd been trained to show in professional contexts. It was something more honest than that. I'm extending the authorization to include this facility, she said, on a day-to-day basis. I need check-ins by 8 every morning. She looked at Mason, who had reassembled the clock's escapement mechanism and was now winding it with focused care. He's extraordinary. Yeah, Grayson said. I mean that as a clinical observation, she said. That level of fine motor skill, combined with the intuitive technical reasoning, it's significant. Whatever this child's life looked like before that road, someone invested in him. Grayson said nothing. She left at 3. Delacroix called at 4:15. Grayson took the call outside on the narrow concrete apron beside the garage door, his back to the wall and the cold coming in off the fields to the north, where the bare corn had been turned under and the soil was the color of old iron. He could hear through the open garage door the sound of Mason and Marcus talking. Not much. Short exchanges, the particular verbal economy of two people who were more interested in the thing in front of them than in the sound of their own voices. Naomi Brooks, Delacroix said. She's confirmed travel. She'll be in the state Friday. Today was Wednesday. 2 days, Grayson said. Yeah. A pause. She knows he's alive. She knows he's in placement. She doesn't know... The trooper's voice adjusted. She doesn't know the extent of his memory loss. That's going to be a conversation. With who? With you, probably. If you're willing. That's not my job, Delacroix. No, the trooper said. It isn't. But she's going to call the placement number, and Patricia Voss is going to give her your number, and she's going to call you. And it'll be better if you're not surprised by what she asks. A pause. She's been looking for him for weeks, Grayson. She went to every hospital, every shelter, filed reports in 4 states. She didn't stop. Who told her to stop? Nobody. That's what I mean. Grayson looked out at the turned field. A crow sat on the far fence line, motionless, watching the distance. What do you know about her? Naomi Brooks, 31, schoolteacher, unmarried, no children. She and Caleb Brooks were close. She's been the one driving the search, not a system, not an organization. Just her. A beat. She sounds... He stopped. She sounds like someone who's been running on nothing for too long. She doesn't know yet that we've confirmed what happened to her brother. The silence that landed between them had weight. Someone has to tell her that, Grayson said. Kansas State Police have a victim services liaison making contact today, Delacroix said. It won't be you. But Friday she'll come here. Yes. And the boy still doesn't know. No. Grayson ended the call and stood in the cold for a while. Through the garage door, he could hear Marcus saying something about valve timing, and Mason asking a question too quiet to make out, and Marcus laughing, a short, genuine sound, the kind you couldn't manufacture. And then the small sound of a tool being set on a steel surface, precise and clean. He went back inside. Reed was at the bar with a coffee and a phone he put face down when Grayson came in. Brewster called, he said. And? Reed's jaw set in a way that meant the conversation had gone the way he'd expected and not the way he'd hoped. He wants a meeting. Tonight? Tomorrow. Wants the full table. Grayson pulled out a stool and sat. The full table meant every senior member. 9 men, not counting himself and Reed, with a range of opinions that he knew well enough to map in his sleep. Most of them would be fine. 2 would be cautious. And Brewster, Carl Brewster, who had been riding with the Iron Shepherds for 12 years and who had strong opinions about the nature and purpose of the club that he expressed with the relentless consistency of someone who'd been told he was right too many times by people who should have pushed back. What's he saying? Grayson asked. That this is a liability, Reed said. That having an unidentified minor in MC-affiliated space creates exposure. Legal, reputational. He paused. He's not wrong that those things exist. Is that what he's actually worried about? Reed was quiet for a second. He used the word circus. He's worried that it becomes something, that people start associating the Shepherds with... A short pause. He said we're not a charity for strays. Something moved in Grayson's expression. Reed saw it and kept talking before it could become anything. I told him to hold that word until tomorrow, Reed said. I told him the table would hear everything and decide together. That's how it works. That's how it works, Grayson said. You know what the vote will be if you walk into that room already decided. I'm already decided? I know, Reed said. That's what I'm telling you to be careful about. From the workbench area, Mason's voice, quiet. This gear's stripped. Marcus. Which one? Second wheel gear. It's been retapped and it won't hold. A pause. Whoever tried to fix this before did it wrong. Marcus. That would be me, about 8 years ago. A beat of silence. Mason. Oh. Marcus unbothered. Yeah. What would you do instead? And they were off again into the specific language of things that could be taken apart and understood and fixed. Grayson watched them from the bar. That night, after Reed had gone and Terry had gone, and Marcus had finally left with the clock, running, accurate to within 15 seconds, under his arm and a look on his face he'd tried to keep neutral and mostly failed, Grayson and Mason sat in the common room under the hanging lights, while the jukebox played something low and slow that neither of them identified. Mason had found a disassembled transistor radio in the storage area that Marcus had apparently also been meaning to get to, and he was working through it with a small flashlight and the deliberate patience of someone who found the process itself as satisfying as the result. Do you want to talk about Friday? Grayson said. Mason didn't look up. What's Friday? Someone's coming to see you. The hand slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. Who? Her name is Naomi. A pause. The radio parts arranged on the table, small and precise. Does she know me? She's looking for you. Has been for a while. Mason set down the component he was holding. Placed it exactly. She knows my name? Yes. The real one? Yes. The boy sat very still. The jukebox finished its song and the room was quiet enough that Grayson could hear the wind against the north wall and the faint creak of the building settling in the cold. Is she... Mason started, stopped, started again differently. Does she know about the... He stopped again. About the accident? Grayson said. Mason's hands went flat on the table, pressed down, palms against the wood, like he was checking whether the surface was solid. Yeah, he said. About that. She knows, Grayson said carefully. Some of it. Not all of it? Not all of it yet. The boy pressed his hands harder against the table. A long silence, then very quietly. Am I going to have to be there when she finds out the rest? Grayson looked at him. The question had arrived with the terrible precision of something that had been assembled in the dark over hours. Specific, pre-aimed, already knowing what the answer might cost. I don't know, Grayson said, because the truth was worth more than comfort. Mason nodded. Once. He picked up the component again and went back to the radio. His hands were steady, steadier than they had any right to be. Thursday arrived with the specific weight of a day that both people in the house were already measuring before breakfast. Mason ate. Grayson drank coffee and watched him eat and didn't say the things he was thinking. They drove to the clubhouse in the truck. The bike was Grayson's preference in all weather that permitted it, but the temperature had dropped overnight and Mason had insufficient cold weather gear, and Grayson was not inclined to test the limits of the green hoodie against a November morning at 50 miles per hour. Marcus was already there. He'd brought the clock back. Figured Mason would want to see it keep time for a day before it goes on the shelf, and had set it on the bar where it ticked with the satisfied regularity of something recently vindicated. He'd also brought, with no explanation offered, a box of miscellaneous small electronics from his classroom that his students had been unable to repair. He set the box on the workbench without comment and poured coffee, and the morning arranged itself. At 10 o'clock, Carl Brewster arrived. He wasn't expected until the evening meeting. His presence now, mid-morning, in the half-populated clubhouse was a statement. Grayson recognized it as such and filed it under the category of things he would address directly and without heat. Brewster was 55, broad, with a gray crew cut and the permanent tan of a man who'd spent decades outdoors and the permanent expression of a man who'd formed his opinions early and found them confirmed often enough to stop updating them. He wore his cut with the particular pride of ownership, not of the club, but of himself within it. He'd served, like most of them had, but in a different war and in a different way, and the experience had made him certain of things that Grayson's experience had made Grayson uncertain of. And this difference was the precise fault line between them. He came in and looked at the room, at Marcus, at Mason, who was at the workbench with his back partly turned, already into the first of the classroom electronics. Brewster's gaze settled on the boy for a beat longer than necessary. Then he came to the bar and poured himself coffee and looked at Grayson. "Heard Voss signed off," he said. "She did. Today." "Today." Brewster drank, set the mug down. "Family's coming Friday." "Yes." "So this is 2 days." "Maybe," Grayson said, "depending on how it goes with the aunt." Brewster's eyes went back to Mason. "He know?" "He knows something's happening. He doesn't know the details." A pause. "Grayson." The voice dropped, not to a confidential register, but to the specific register Brewster used when he was about to say something he'd been carrying for a while. "I've got nothing against the kid. You understand that?" "I do." "But what happens at the meeting tonight, I need you to hear it as the table hearing it, not as me coming after you." "I always hear it that way," Grayson said. "No," Brewster said, not unkindly. "You don't. When someone disagrees with Grayson Mercer hears it as someone who doesn't understand." He kept his eyes level. "I understand. That's the difference." Grayson looked at him. "There are brothers in this club who've been through custody situations," Brewster said, "who've been on the wrong end of a family court's opinion about what an MC means, who've lost visitation, lost time over associations that people like Patricia Voss didn't fully understand even when they were trying to." He paused. "This boy being here is a risk for them, not just for us as a club, for them specifically." Grayson hadn't thought about that. He sat with it for a moment, which was the honest thing to do. "Tonight," he said finally. "We'll talk tonight." Brewster nodded. He drank his coffee and left without speaking to Mason, which was either restraint or avoidance, and Grayson wasn't certain which. Reed arrived at noon. He'd heard about Brewster's morning visit through the specific telegraph system of the club that operated faster than any phone network and with better accuracy. He came in and looked at Grayson and said, "He came early." "He did." "How was it?" "Honest," Grayson said. "Which is worse than hostile." Reed acknowledged this with a slow nod. The afternoon moved in the particular way of days that contain an event later, with a kind of borrowed lightness in the early hours and a gathering weight as the hours progress. Marcus stayed. Terry came in at 2 and went immediately to her workbench without looking at anyone and stayed there, which was normal. A brother named Gil Reyes arrived around 3, younger than most of them, 37, with 2 kids of his own and the specific weariness of a man running between his family and his brotherhood and never quite arriving anywhere on time. He came in and saw Mason and said nothing, and then went to the bar and got coffee and watched the boy work for about 5 minutes before saying, "What's in the box?" Mason looked at the box without looking up from what he was doing. "Broken stuff." "Yeah?" Gil pulled up a stool on the other side of the workbench. "What kind?" "Calculator. Radio. Something I think is a meter of some kind, but 2 pieces are missing." He paused. "Walkie-talkie." "Which are you doing first?" "The meter," Mason said. "Because it's hardest." Gil looked at the thing, then at Mason. "How do you know it's hardest if pieces are missing?" "Because you have to figure out what the missing pieces were before you can fix what's broken," Mason said, with the complete matter-of-factness of someone who hadn't yet learned to make elementary logic sound like insight. Gil looked at Grayson across the room with an expression that Grayson chose not to respond to directly. The evening meeting convened at 7. 9 brothers around the long table in the back room, plus Grayson and Reed, Brewster at the far end, Gil Reyes near the middle, a man named Hatch who'd been with the Shepherds almost as long as Grayson and who said very little in meetings and meant everything he said, a man named Paul Sims who was 48 and who had been in a custody dispute 3 years ago that had lasted 16 months and cost him $12,000, and whose jaw had gone tight the moment Grayson started talking. Grayson laid it out straight. No performance, no appeal to emotion, just facts in order. The accident, the guardrail, the hospital, the authorization, the aunt coming Friday. What Mason could do with his hands, and what that meant about who he'd been before the road took everything. What Brewster had said that morning about risk, which Grayson repeated word for word and attributed correctly because Brewster's argument deserved to be heard on its own terms. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Sims said, "Friday." "Yes." "And if the aunt situation is complicated, if there's a custody process, if it goes longer than Friday?" "Then we talk about it again," Grayson said. "I'm not asking for indefinite. I'm asking for now." Hatch, who hadn't spoken, "The boys in the main room?" "With Marcus," Grayson said. Hatch stood up and opened the back room door and looked through it for a moment, and then closed it again and sat back down. Nobody asked what he'd seen. "He's fine," Hatch said. That was all. Brewster. "I want it on record that I think this creates exposure." "It's on record," Reed said, "and I want it on record that my concern is for the brothers in this room, not for optics." "Carl," Gil Reyes said, and his voice was quiet. "My daughter is 7. If she was on a guardrail in the rain—" He stopped. "I'm voting yes." Brewster looked at him. The argument he'd been building met the wall of that and didn't find a way over it. The vote was 8-1. Brewster voted no. He voted no, and then he sat at the table and didn't leave, which told Grayson what Brewster's no actually meant. Not I refuse, but I want it noted that I see the risk, which was different, which was, in its way, the most honest thing Brewster could have done. Grayson came out of the back room and found Mason asleep on the long bench against the north wall, his head on a folded jacket that Marcus had put under him without waking him up. The clock on the bar ticked. The jukebox was off. Marcus was at the bar with a cold coffee and a book he wasn't reading. "He went out about an hour ago," Marcus said quietly. "Just—" He made a soft downward gesture with one hand. "Tipped over." Grayson sat at the bar and looked at the sleeping boy. His hands were loose in front of him, the careful, deliberate hands that knew things his mind currently couldn't access, and in sleep they looked smaller. He looked, asleep, like exactly what he was, a child who had been awake in the dark for too long and had finally found a place where he could stop. Grayson's phone buzzed. Unknown number, Kansas area code. He took it outside. "Mr. Mercer?" The voice was a woman's, and it had the specific texture of someone who had been holding something very large for a very long time and was now holding it with both hands because putting it down terrified her more than the weight did. "This is Naomi Brooks. They told me you have my nephew." "Yes," Grayson said. "He's safe." A sound on the line that wasn't words. Then, "Is he? They said he doesn't remember." "Some things are coming back," Grayson said carefully. "Some things aren't. He stopped, started again. "He fixed a carburetor this morning and diagnosed a stripped gear and repaired a clock escapement, and he's been asleep for an hour on a bench in my clubhouse." He paused. "He's okay. For right now, in this moment, he's okay." Silence. Then very quietly, "He loves engines. His dad taught him. They would spend whole Saturdays—" She stopped. Her breath was audible across the distance. "Miss Brooks," Grayson said, "the people here will take care of him until you arrive." "Friday," she said. "I'm driving. I can't—" A small break in the word. "I can't fly. I need to be able to stop if I need to stop." "I understand." "Does he—" She paused. Her voice shifted into the register of someone about to ask a question they weren't sure they wanted answered. "Does he know about Caleb and Lydia?" The cold was absolute. The field beyond the parking lot was a solid, dark plain under a sky with too many stars. "No," Grayson said. A long silence. "He was there," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "And he walked away." "Yes." Another silence. Longer. He let it exist. On her end, he could hear breathing and what might have been wind and what might have been something else. "Someone has to tell him," she said. Yes, Grayson said. Before I get there, she said. He can't find out when he sees my face. He can't. She stopped. He'll know from my face. He always knew everything from people's faces, even when he was little. Caleb used to say. She stopped again, and this time the stop was the kind that meant she'd reached a sentence she couldn't finish, because the person in it wasn't available to be talked about yet, without it costing something she wasn't ready to pay. Grayson stood in the dark outside the clubhouse on a November night in the middle of what had been, 48 hours ago, a normal week, and understood with full clarity what was being asked of him. Nobody in the system was going to do this. Not Delacroix, not Voss, not the Kansas Victim Services liaison who delivered the news to Naomi in her own language of professional distance. Nobody was going to sit across from a 10-year-old boy with storm-gray eyes and careful hands and say the words that would confirm what that boy had been carrying since he walked away from a crash in the dark. Nobody except the man on the motorcycle who'd stayed when everyone else was looking in the wrong direction. I'll tell him, Grayson said. The sound Naomi Brooks made on the other end of the line was not relief. It was something older and harder than relief. The sound of a weight that doesn't get lighter when someone else agrees to share it, but that you can at least be grateful you're not carrying entirely alone. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he agreed. He stood outside for a long time after he hung up. The stars were very clear. The temperature had dropped below freezing while they'd been inside, and the gravel in the parking lot had a faint crust of frost that caught the security light in small, cold sparks. Tomorrow he was going to walk back into the Iron Shepherd clubhouse and find Mason, Ethan Brooks, who had named himself Mason in a garage while fixing a carburetor, who fixed things he didn't know he knew how to fix, whose father had spent whole Saturdays teaching him how engines worked, and he was going to say words that could not be taken back. And whatever happened after those words, there was no version of Friday that looked the same as today. The door of the clubhouse opened behind him. Reed stepped out, leather jacket, hands in his pockets, reading the situation without asking about it. Tomorrow? Reed said. Tomorrow, Grayson said. Reed nodded. He stood beside Grayson in the cold for a moment, looking at the dark field. Then he said quietly, You want company when you do it? Grayson thought about it. About a boy who'd chosen a name for himself in a garage and fallen asleep on a bench under a jacket that wasn't his, who had fixed every broken thing put in front of him and not yet found a way to fix the one thing that mattered. No, he said. Just me. Reed nodded. He went back inside. Grayson stayed in the cold a minute longer. Then he followed. Inside, the clock on the bar ticked. Steady, accurate, fixed. Mason slept. And in the morning, everything was going to break open. And Grayson Mercer, who had never in his life walked away from a road because it was hard, was going to have to find out whether the most difficult thing he'd ever been asked to carry was a weight he could actually bear. Friday morning arrived the way bad things usually did. Quietly, without announcement, under a sky the color of old concrete that pressed down on the hills and made everything below it feel smaller than it was. Grayson was awake at 5. He hadn't slept past 4:30 in 3 days. His body had made the decision for him, pulling him up out of shallow sleep with the specific restlessness of a man who knows something is coming and whose nervous system refuses to pretend otherwise. He made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the dark yard lighten by degrees, the frost on the grass going from invisible to visible to a pale silver film that caught the first gray of dawn and held it. Mason was still asleep. He'd come back to the house last night for the first time since the first night. The clubhouse was available, the brothers were there, but Grayson had made the call quietly, and Mason had accepted it without comment, climbing into the truck without being asked twice. He was asleep in the spare room now. Had been since 9:30. The particular sleep of someone who was resting in front of a storm they couldn't see yet but could feel in their chest. At 6:15, Grayson went and stood in the hallway outside the spare room door. He stood there for a full minute, listening to the boy breathe, organizing the words. There was no good order for them. He'd learned that about certain conversations, that the sequencing didn't matter because the weight was in the content, not the arrangement, and no arrangement would make the content easier to receive. What mattered was the space you held around the words, what you did with your body and your face while you said them. Whether the person hearing them understood that you weren't going anywhere after. He knocked. Soft. 2 knuckles. A pause. Then, yeah. He opened the door. Mason was sitting up in the bed with the green hoodie already on. He'd slept in it, which Grayson had noticed before and hadn't commented on, understanding that for some people a specific item of clothing became load-bearing in ways that had nothing to do with warmth. His hair was flattened on one side. The bandage at his hairline had been replaced yesterday with a smaller strip of medical tape, the wound beneath it clean and closing. He looked at Grayson with alert eyes that said he'd been awake for a while already. "Coffee?" Grayson said. "Okay." They sat at the kitchen table. The clock on the wall said 6:20. Outside, the first real light was arriving, pale and reluctant, the kind of November morning light that never quite committed to being day. Grayson put his hands around his mug. He looked at Mason, who was looking at his own hands around his mug, and he said, "I need to tell you something." Mason's hands tightened on the mug. Just slightly. He didn't look up. "About the accident," Grayson said, still looking at his hands. "Yeah. I should have told you sooner," Grayson said. I was waiting for the right time, and there isn't one. There's no right time for this." Now Mason looked up. His eyes were very steady, the eyes of someone who had already decided to take whatever came without falling, who had been practicing that decision in the dark for 3 days without knowing he was practicing. "Your parents were in the car," Grayson said. He said it straight. No softening, no preamble, no professional distance. Just the truth moving from his mouth to the space between them. "Your father was driving. Your mother was with him." He paused one beat. "They didn't survive the accident, Mason." The kitchen was very quiet. Mason looked at him. The expression on his face did something complicated. Not the dramatic collapse that people who hadn't been near real grief sometimes expected, but a series of very small adjustments, like a structure taking on weight and redistributing it through its load-bearing points, testing whether it would hold. His jaw moved. His eyes went somewhere briefly that wasn't the room. Then they came back. "I know," he said. Grayson went still. "I knew," Mason said. His voice was rough. Not from emotion, from the specific roughness of saying out loud something that had been living in the body for days, compressed, taking up space that should have been for breathing. "I woke up and—" He stopped. His hands pressed flat on the table, the same gesture Grayson had seen in the clubhouse, the checking whether the surface is solid gesture. "I was in the back seat, and I woke up and it was raining and I couldn't—" He stopped again. His throat worked. "I couldn't hear anything. It was quiet. And the front of the car—" He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. "I got out," he said, "and I walked away. I didn't—" His voice broke, once, cleanly, and then came back. "I didn't know what else to do." Grayson said nothing. He stayed exactly where he was, and he let the boy talk. "His name was Caleb," Mason said. "My dad, Caleb." He said the name carefully, like he was finding it for the first time, even though it had been inside him all along. We were going somewhere. I don't remember where. We were always going somewhere." His face did something brief and undefended. "He had this thing," he said, "when we got in the car. He always said, 'Let's see what's around the next bend,' every time, even if we'd driven the road before." He pressed harder on the table. "I can hear him say it, but I can't—" His voice dropped. "I can't see his face right now. I can't see it." "It'll come back," Grayson said. "You don't know that." "No," Grayson said. "I don't. But I've seen people lose access to things and get them back. And everything you've put your hands on in the last 4 days came back. How to fix an engine, how to set a clock, things that were in you before this. They came back." Mason looked at him. "Your dad put those things there," Grayson said quietly. "You're walking around with everything he taught you still running inside you. That doesn't go away because you can't see his face right now." The boy's chin dropped for a moment. Just a moment. Then he lifted it back up, and there was something in his face that was not acceptance and not peace, but something more sustainable than either, a decision to continue. "My mom's name was Lydia," he said. "She played guitar." She played it at night when she thought I was asleep. Old songs. He paused. I can still hear the guitar. Yeah, Grayson said. Naomi's coming today. Yes. Her and my mom. He stopped. They were sisters. Yes. Mason looked at his coffee. Does she know about? She knows, Grayson said. She found out earlier this week. A long pause. Is she okay? The question arrived with such complete absence of self-pity that Grayson had to take a second before answering. This boy, sitting at a kitchen table at 6:30 in the morning, having just confirmed out loud for the first time that both of his parents were dead, asking whether someone else was okay. She's coming, Grayson said. She drove through the night. That's how okay she is. Something in Mason's face shifted. Something small and fundamental. He picked up his coffee mug and drank from it and set it back down and said, Can we go to the clubhouse? Yeah, Grayson said. We can go to the clubhouse. They drove in silence. Not the silence of two people with nothing to say, but the silence of two people who had said the necessary thing and were now moving through the space after it, which required its own kind of quiet. The county road was empty. Frost on the fields, the dead corn rows running to the horizon in parallel lines, the sky still the color of old concrete, though a pale strip of something lighter was appearing at the tree line to the east. Mason watched the window the whole way. Not at anything specific. Just watching the world go by at 40 miles per hour, the way you watched it when the world had recently reorganized itself around you and you needed to confirm that it was still moving in the same direction it had been. At one point, between two long curves in the road, he said, He would have liked you. Grayson didn't take his eyes off the road. Your dad? Yeah. A pause. He liked guys who did things without making a big deal about it. Grayson said nothing. He drove. The clubhouse was already open when they arrived. Marcus's truck in the lot. The garage bay doors up despite the cold, which meant Marcus had been there long enough to have stopped minding the temperature. The lights were on. Through the open bay, the sound of a radio. Something country, early morning, the kind of station that played real songs before 9 o'clock. Mason got out of the truck and stood in the cold for a moment, looking at the building. Then he went inside. Marcus looked up from the workbench when they came in. He read the room in approximately 3 seconds. Grayson's face, Mason's face, the particular quality of the air between them, and said nothing. Just handed Mason a coffee he'd already poured and hadn't been drinking, and went back to what he was working on. That was, Grayson thought, the right move. That was exactly the right move. Terry Van arrived at 8. Then Gil Reyes with his younger brother who'd been visiting for the week, a quiet man named Cesar who rode and said little and helped when asked. By 9, the clubhouse had its morning population, and Mason had established himself at the workbench with the remaining electronics from Marcus's box, and the morning ran in the low-key way of mornings that were holding space for something bigger coming later. At 10:47, a car turned onto the county road. Grayson was outside when he heard it. A silver sedan moving too carefully for someone who knew the road. The particular caution of a driver who was paying full attention to something other than the driving. He watched it come up the gravel and stop, and he watched the door open, and he watched Naomi Brooks get out. She was 31, and she looked it in the way people looked their age when they'd been spending it, honestly. Medium height, dark hair pulled back, wearing a canvas jacket over a gray sweater. She had Caleb Brooks's jaw. Grayson could see it clearly from the photographs Delacroix had shown him, and she had the eyes of someone who'd been crying recently enough that the evidence was still there, and far enough ago that she'd stopped apologizing for it. She stood beside her car and looked at the clubhouse, and then at Grayson walking toward her, and her face did 6 things in 2 seconds, and then went still. Mr. Mercer, she said. Naomi. He put out his hand. She took it with both of hers, briefly, a grip that said thank you in a way she wasn't going to attempt with words yet. How is he? He's good, Grayson said. This morning we had a conversation. He's okay. He's inside. Her eyes went to the clubhouse door. Does he knows you're coming. He knows you're here now. Grayson paused. He asked if you were okay, this morning. After I told him about his parents, his first question was whether you were okay. Naomi Brooks pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose for a moment. That's Ethan, she said quietly. That's always been Ethan. He's been going by Mason, Grayson said. He chose it himself. I'd use it. She looked at him. Why Mason? I don't know. He hasn't said, but it's his. She nodded. Something in her expression acknowledged the wisdom of this without needing to discuss it. Does he remember me? He knows your name. He knows you and his mother were sisters. Whether he has visual memory, specific memories, Grayson stopped. I'd let him tell you what he has. Yeah, she said. Yeah, okay. They stood for a moment in the cold outside the clubhouse. The bare fields, the pale sky, the sound of the radio from inside, something slow now, fiddle and steel guitar. I need to tell you something, Naomi said. Her tone shifted, just slightly, enough that Grayson noticed. I found something, she said, in Caleb's things. After I was notified, I drove to the last place they'd been staying, a motel outside of Hardin. They'd paid a week in advance, and the room was still... She stopped, pressed her lips together again. There was a bag, Caleb's road bag. He always kept a document folder in it. Insurance papers, registration, the things you take with you. She reached into her canvas jacket and removed an envelope, standard white, sealed, her name written on the front in a hand that wasn't hers. She held it out to Grayson. He wrote it before they left Kansas, she said. The postmark on the outer envelope, there was a mailing envelope over it, was 2 weeks before the accident. He mailed it to himself at the motel, so it would be there when they arrived. Her voice was very steady. I think he knew where they were going. I think he knew what was at the end of the road. Grayson looked at the envelope, did not take it yet. What does it say? Part of it is for me, she said. The parts that aren't. That's why I'm showing it to you. She paused. There's a name in it. A name Caleb wrote down as the one person he trusted to find if something happened to them. She met his eyes. Your name, Mr. Mercer, written down 2 weeks before that road. The cold pressed in from the fields. Inside the clubhouse, the radio played. Grayson took the envelope. He read it standing there in the parking lot with Naomi watching his face. Caleb Brooks wrote the way he apparently lived, without performance, without unnecessary decoration, in the direct language of a man who wanted to be understood and had stopped worrying about whether he'd be liked. The letter to Naomi was private, and Grayson moved past it quickly, his eyes finding the section she'd meant him to find. If something happens to both of us on this road, and if Ethan is alive, find Grayson Mercer of the Iron Shepherd MC. We crossed paths with him 3 times over 4 years at veterans' charity runs. The Millhaven Run, the Cradle Ridge Run, the Border Run in 2021. He never knew we were watching, but we watched. He's the kind of man who stays when everyone else is looking in the wrong direction. Lydia agreed. If Ethan needs someone to stay, it's him. We never told him. We should have. I'm sorry for leaving this weight with you, Naomi. Find Mercer. Grayson read it twice. Then he folded it and handed it back. Naomi was watching him. You didn't know them, she said. Did you? Not by name, he said. The charity runs. I lead them. I don't always... He stopped. I don't always know everyone who comes. They came 3 years running, she said. Caleb played guitar at the camp setup on the Cradle Ridge Run. You told him his playing was decent. Grayson looked at her. He remembered it for 2 years, she said. Quiet. He wasn't a man people said kind things to without meaning them. He held on to it. The radio inside had gone to a commercial. In the silence between songs, Grayson could hear, faintly, the sound of Mason talking to Marcus about something. Just the register of it, not the words, the particular back and forth of 2 people involved in a shared problem. He chose you before the road chose you, Naomi said. I needed you to know that. Grayson's throat was tight in a way he hadn't expected and didn't have time to manage. He moved past it by doing what he'd always done. He focused on what was in front of him and let the thing in his chest wait. Come inside, he said. He brought her in through the side door rather than the main entrance. Not to hide her arrival, Mason knew she was coming, but to give the boy a moment to register it on his own terms rather than having her appear in the full social context of the clubhouse with everyone watching. Grayson had learned a long time ago that the moments that mattered most needed the smallest possible audience. Marcus saw them come in and said something quietly to Mason at the workbench. Mason turned. He looked at Naomi Brooks from across the room. She looked at him. Whatever recognition does when it arrives in a person who has lost their access to memory is not clean and it is not simple. It doesn't arrive as a completed thing. It arrives the way things arrive in cold weather, in fragments, by degrees, the surface first and then the depth. Mason's face went through something that Grayson could not have named and that he did not try to name because naming it would have diminished it. The boy stood at the workbench with his hands at his sides, and he looked at Naomi, and something moved behind his eyes like a tide coming in slow and certain and unavoidable. Naomi didn't cross the room. She let him come to her if he was going to. She stood still, and she let her face be completely open. Every exhausted line of it, every evidence of what the last weeks had cost her. And she let the boy see all of it. He walked across the room. He stopped 2 feet from her. He looked up at her face. "You used to braid Lydia's hair," he said. Not a question. Something arriving from somewhere he hadn't been able to access. She'd sit on the kitchen floor and you'd sit behind her on the chair. You did it with your eyes closed. Naomi's eyes filled. She did not reach for him. She waited. "Yeah," she said. "Every Sunday night." "She smelled like cedar," he said. "She kept cedar blocks in her drawer." "She got that from our mother," Naomi said. Mason stood in front of her for another moment. Then he moved forward and pressed his face against her shoulder, and her arms came around him. And she held him, the way people held things they'd been afraid they'd lost permanently, with a grip that understood the difference between now and forever, that knew this moment was real and did not yet know what came next and had decided that what was real right now was enough. Nobody in the room looked away. Nobody pretended to look at something else. The Iron Shepherds were not men who practiced emotional performance, and in this moment their stillness was not uncomfortable witnessing. It was something more like honor. The specific respect of people who understood loss and who knew that some things deserved to be seen. Mason cried. Not loudly. With the particular suppressed intensity of someone who'd been holding it back for days with both hands, and who finally, in this specific moment with this specific person, allowed the hold to release. His shoulders moved. His breath went ragged and came back. Naomi held him, and she was crying too, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and the clubhouse was absolutely quiet except for the clock on the bar and the winter wind against the north wall. Grayson stood near the bar and felt something in his own chest that he didn't examine closely. He picked up a coffee mug and held it and looked at the floor. When it was over, when Mason had stepped back and wiped his face with the sleeve of the green hoodie with the practical unself-consciousness of a child who'd been taught that crying was not a thing that required shame, Naomi opened the canvas bag she'd carried in, and she put 3 things on the nearest table. A photograph, a folded piece of paper, a small metal object. Mason looked at the table. He looked at the photograph first, a family photograph, the 3 of them, a rest stop somewhere with mountains behind. Caleb Brooks with his arm around Lydia and Mason between them, in a red jacket, squinting into the sun. He picked it up and held it, and his face moved through something quiet and private, and then he set it down with the precision of a person handling a fragile object. He looked at the folded paper. He looked at the metal object. He picked up the metal object. It was a pocket knife. Old. The handle was dark wood, worn smooth, the brass fittings along the edge verdigris green. He turned it over in his hands, and his thumbs found the mechanism, and he opened it, smoothly, without hesitation, his hands knowing the action, and the blade caught the light. "His," Mason said. "His grandfather's," Naomi said. "Caleb carried it every day." She paused. "He kept it for you. He told me before they left. If anything happened, Ethan gets the knife." Mason closed it, held it in his fist. The fist went to his chest and pressed there, over the green hoodie, over the ribs, over whatever was happening inside them. He looked at the folded paper. "That one you can read later," Naomi said quietly. "Or not at all. It's from your dad." Mason's hand went out and touched the edge of the paper. Didn't pick it up, just touched it. Then he left it on the table and turned to Naomi. "How long are you staying?" "I drove through the night," she said. "I'm staying as long as you need." He looked at her. Something in his expression, not a smile, not yet, but the structural precursor to one, the bones of it. "I fixed a jukebox yesterday," he said. Naomi blinked. "What?" "The one over there. The capacitors were shot. Marcus had spares." Marcus, from across the room, utterly neutral. "He found the problem in 11 minutes. Naomi looked at her nephew, then at the jukebox, then at the room around her. The men at the bar and the workbench, the bikes in the garage, the photographs on the dark walls, the clock on the bar that ticked with the satisfaction of a restored thing. Her expression moved through something complex and arrived somewhere that was not simple enough to be called any one thing. Grayson refilled his coffee. He didn't interrupt. At noon, Grayson stepped outside to call Delacroix with an update, and while he was on the phone, a second car came up the gravel road. He watched it come without recognition. A black SUV, rental plates, moving with the particular confident speed of a vehicle driven by someone who knew the road better than they should. It stopped at the far end of the parking lot. Nobody got out immediately. Grayson ended his call. The SUV sat, engine running. Grayson could see the exhaust hanging in the cold air. Reed's Softail was in the lot. Terry's bike. 2 others. Grayson looked at the SUV and felt his gut run the specific diagnostic it ran when something didn't fit the pattern of the day he'd planned. Quick, automatic, comprehensive. The door opened. A man got out. Mid-40s, gray suit under an open overcoat, no tie, dress shoes that were wrong for a gravel parking lot. He had the groomed, particular confidence of someone who worked inside institutions and was accustomed to being the person in the room that other people adjusted toward. He looked at the clubhouse, at the bikes, at Grayson, and he came across the gravel with his hands in his coat pockets and an expression calibrated to convey reasonableness. "Mr. Mercer," he said. Not a question. "Yeah. My name is Kenneth Ferris." He produced a card. Grayson looked at it. An attorney's office in Kansas City, family law, the kind of embossed card that communicated that the firm it represented had been established long enough to afford embossing. "I represent the interests of the Brooks estate and certain collateral parties with standing in the matter of Ethan Brooks's custody and care." Grayson held the card. He looked at Ferris. "Who sent you?" "My clients prefer to remain confidential at this stage," Ferris said pleasantly. "For now, I'm simply here to—" "Who sent you?" Grayson said again, and his voice had moved to the register that was not loud and was not threatening, and that had, over 23 years, communicated clearly to people that the performance portion of the conversation was over. Ferris recalibrated. Slightly. "There are family members on both the Brooks and the Mercer-Nash side who have questions about the current placement arrangement," he said. "Questions about—" He looked at the clubhouse, at the bikes, at Grayson's cut. The appropriateness of the environment in which a minor is currently residing. "Mercer-Nash," Grayson said. "The maternal family line. Lydia Brooks, née Nash." A pause. "She has living relatives who have recently become aware of the situation and who have standing to petition the court regarding—" "Naomi Brooks is inside," Grayson said. "She drove through the night to get here. She's the boy's blood aunt and his family's named guardian." Ferris's expression did something careful. "Naomi Brooks has not been confirmed by any court as legal guardian. The process for that is—" "Who are the Nash family members?" Grayson said. "Specifically. I'm not at liberty to—" "You came to my property," Grayson said, "to a place where a traumatized child is currently with his family. You drove here in a rental car in a suit, and you will not tell me who sent you." He kept his voice completely even. "That's interesting." Ferris looked at him. The pleasant calibration was still present, but it was working harder than it had been. "Mr. Mercer, I'm not here to create conflict. I'm here to—" The clubhouse door opened. Reed came out. Not urgently. He'd heard the car, the way Reed always heard things, and had come to see what it was. He stood on the step and looked at Ferris and at the SUV and at Grayson's face, and he said nothing. Terry Van came out behind him. She leaned against the doorframe and put a cigarette between her teeth and didn't light it and watched. Ferris looked at them. His confidence was intact, but Grayson could see him running the room math. 3 people, a clubhouse, a row of motorcycles, a situation that was several standard deviations from the kind of office or courtroom where his usual competencies applied. You should leave, Grayson said. Today. Mr. Mercer, I'm not threatening you, Grayson said. I'm giving you a sequence of events. You go back to your clients, and you tell them that Naomi Brooks is here, and she's stable, and the boy is with her, and he's stable, and any petition regarding custody goes through the established legal process, which begins with Patricia Voss at Cradle Ridge Social Services. He held the card out. Take this back. You'll want to hand it to whoever hired you personally. Ferris took the card. He looked at it. He looked at Grayson. My clients have significant resources, he said quietly. Not a threat. Something worse than a threat. A fact stated by someone who believed facts were sufficient. Good, Grayson said. Get a good lawyer. Ferris went back to the SUV. He drove out with the careful speed of a rival. The gravel settled behind him. Grayson stood in the parking lot. Reed came down the step. Who was that? Someone's attorney. Whose? Nash family, Grayson said. Lydia's side. They want standing for a custody petition. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then, how fast can they move? Faster than we can, Grayson said. If they have resources. Reed looked at the road where the SUV had gone. His jaw was set. Does Naomi know? Not yet. Voss? I need to call her. Grayson? Reed's voice dropped. Not softer. More precise. This changes the Friday picture. I know. If someone's already retained an attorney and traveled to make a personal visit? I know, Grayson said again. They're not going through the system, Reed said. They're going around it. That card was a message. Grayson looked at the road. The SUV was long gone, just the dust of it still settling on the gravel, already thinning in the cold air. Around him, the Iron Shepherd clubhouse stood solid and scarred against the flat gray sky, and inside it a boy sat with his dead father's knife pressed against his chest, while his aunt held his shoulder and a clock that he'd fixed ticked on the bar. He'd been the one who stayed at the guardrail. He'd been the one Caleb Brooks had written down as the person to find. He'd been the one who'd said the words this morning that no one else was going to say. And now someone in Kansas who had resources and an attorney in a suit was coming for the boy that Grayson had found in the dark. And Naomi Brooks, who had driven through the night on nothing and love, was inside a clubhouse about to find out that the road ahead of her was not the road she'd thought it was. He went back inside. Naomi was at the table with Mason. They were looking at the photograph together, Naomi talking quietly about something. He caught the word Kansas and the word summer, and Mason was listening with his elbows on the table and his chin in his hands and his father's knife in his fist, and the image had the specific quality of something that deserved to last longer than circumstances were going to allow it to. Grayson caught Reed's eye. Reed nodded and moved to the bar. Grayson pulled a chair up across from Naomi. She looked at his face, and whatever she saw there made her go still. What happened? She said. Someone came to the parking lot, Grayson said. An attorney, Kansas City firm. He said he represents the Nash family, your sister's family of origin. Naomi's expression did something that moved through surprise and arrived at something older and darker. Which Nash family member? She said. He wouldn't say. Lydia's uncle, Naomi said. Her voice had gone flat. Not emotionally flat, the flatness of someone who had been bracing for a specific thing for a long time and had just heard its name. Leonard Nash. He tried to contest Caleb and Lydia's estate once before, 3 years ago. A property dispute. She paused. He has money, and he has a lawyer who charges for the smell of his cologne. She looked at Mason, who was watching them both with the careful attention he brought to everything. And he has never once in Ethan's life come to a birthday party or a school concert or a single Sunday dinner. He has standing as a blood relative, Grayson said. Ethan doesn't know him. That won't matter in a petition. Naomi's jaw tightened. She looked at Grayson. What does this mean? Right now? Today? It means someone with resources has already retained counsel and traveled to present a card in person, Grayson said. That's not someone who filed a form yesterday. That's someone who's been moving since they heard the boy was alive. Kept his voice level. It means you need your own attorney. Today. Not Monday. Today. It's Friday afternoon. I know. She pressed both hands flat on the table. The same gesture as Mason, the same gesture, the genetics of it, across a generation. I was named in Caleb and Lydia's will, she said. I have the documents. You need someone who speaks the language those documents need to speak in a family court in this state, Grayson said, because Leonard Nash is not going through normal channels. That attorney driving out here, that's someone who doesn't wait. Mason was looking at them both. He'd been following the conversation with the alert tracking of someone who understood that the adults around him were managing something larger than they were saying. He looked at Grayson. Someone's trying to take me somewhere, he said. Not a child's fearful question, a flat assessment, offered as information, as if he were identifying a stripped gear. Grayson looked at him. Someone is going to try, he said. Mason held the knife in his fist. He looked at the table. He looked at the photograph. Then he looked at Naomi. You're not going to let that happen. Naomi looked at her nephew. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were completely clear. No, she said. I'm not. Mason nodded once. He set the knife on the table. He picked up the folded letter. His father's letter, the one he'd touched and set back down. And he put it in the pocket of the green hoodie without opening it. He stood up from the table. I need to fix the second walkie-talkie, he said. The first one's done. He walked back to the workbench. Marcus handed him a screwdriver without being asked. Grayson sat across from Naomi Brooks, and they looked at each other across the table, and the clock ticked. And outside the window, the gray sky pressed down on the bare fields, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the thing in front of them was no longer about a child being found. It was about whether the people who had found him were willing to fight to keep him. The call from Patricia Voss came at 4:17. Grayson took it standing at the bar while Naomi was on her own phone in the back room, her voice low and controlled. The voice of a woman who had found her attorney and was now feeding her the architecture of a fight. Mason was at the workbench. The second walkie-talkie was done. He'd moved on to the calculator. His hands never stopped. Mr. Mercer? Voss's voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before. Tight. Measured in the way things were measured when the person measuring them was managing something they hadn't expected. I've received a filing notification from Cradle Ridge Family Court, an emergency petition for temporary guardianship, filed this afternoon at 2:30. 2:30. Ferris had filed before he'd even driven out to deliver his card. The visit hadn't been an opening move. It had been a notification of a move already made. Leonard Nash, Grayson said. A pause. You knew. I knew someone was coming, not how fast. He kept his voice flat. What does the petition say? It cites concerns about the suitability of the current placement environment. She paused again, and in the pause he could hear her choosing her next words with surgical care. It specifically references the placement's association with a motorcycle club. It uses the term outlaw organization. The common room was quiet. Reed, who was close enough to hear one side of the call, had gone very still. When is the hearing? Grayson said. Monday morning, Voss said. Emergency calendar. The judge assigned is... A pause. Grayson. The judge assigned has a history of conservative placement decisions. I want you to understand what Monday looks like if Naomi Brooks doesn't walk in with documentation that is completely airtight. She has the will, Grayson said. She needs more than the will, Voss said. She needs a family court attorney who has appeared before this specific judge. She needs character documentation for the placement. She needs... She stopped. She needs everything, and she needs it by Monday morning at 8. It was Friday at 4:17. He ended the call. He looked at Reed. Reed looked back at him. How bad? Monday, emergency hearing. Grayson set his phone on the bar. They filed before Ferris even got here. They've been building the petition for days. Reed's jaw set. His hands, which had been loose at his sides, closed slowly. They knew he was alive before Naomi did. The thought landed. Grayson picked it back up and turned it over. Leonard Nash, who had contested an estate 3 years ago, who had resources, who had an attorney on retainer fast enough to file a same-day emergency petition, who had known, somehow, through channels, through the systemic leakage of information that happened in family cases that touched multiple states, that Ethan Brooks had been found, before the family had been told, before Naomi had been confirmed. Someone in the system talked, Grayson said. Who knew? Kansas State Police, the Victim Services Liaison, whoever ran the VIN cross-reference. He stopped. It doesn't matter right now. Right now what matters is Monday. He went to the back room. Naomi was off her phone. She was sitting at the table with both hands flat on it and her eyes forward, and the expression of a woman who had received information in the last 10 minutes that had rearranged the landscape. She looked up when Grayson came in. My attorney says the petition is filed, she said. She says Nash's firm has 3 partners who specialize in emergency family court motions. She says, she stopped. She says it's going to be close. Your attorney has appeared before this judge? Once. She says he's... Naomi stopped again. Her jaw tightened. She says he has a specific bias against non-traditional households. That's her language. Non-traditional. Grayson sat. What do you need? Character witnesses, she said. For the placement. For the environment Ethan has been in. People who can speak to what they've seen here. She looked at him steadily. Your club members, Grayson. I need your club members to walk into a family court on Monday morning and testify about what they witnessed this week, about what Ethan was like here, what he did, what they saw. Grayson thought about the vote Thursday night, 8-1. He thought about Brewster, who had voted no and stayed anyway. He thought about Paul Sims, who had lost 16 months to a custody dispute and who had gone quiet when Grayson described the hearing. I'll call the table tonight, he said. There's something else, Naomi said. Her voice shifted, smaller. My attorney asked me, she asked if there was anything the Nash side could use, anything about this environment this week that could be... She looked at him. She said courts look for anything, any inconsistency, any... Brewster, Grayson said. Naomi blinked. One of my brothers voted against having Mason here, he said. It's not a secret. If Nash's attorney is thorough enough, he'll find the meeting happened, find that there was a dissent. He kept his voice level. I need to talk to Brewster before Monday. He made the calls from the parking lot in the dark. The temperature had dropped below 30, and his breath hung in front of him in visible clouds, and he stood with his back against the building and his phone hot against his ear and worked through the list. Marcus. Immediately. No question. Tell me when, and I'll be there. Terry. 3 seconds of silence, then, what do I wear to court? He said, whatever you want. She said, wrong answer. Then, I'll figure it out. Gil Reyes. My 2 kids are going to know that I did this. That's all I need. Hatch. Didn't speak, just said, yeah, and hung up. Paul Sims. The longest pause. Long enough that Grayson counted it. 11 seconds. Then, I know what a courtroom like that does to a kid. I'll be there. Brewster. The last call. Grayson stood in the dark and dialed and listened to it ring. Brewster picked up on the 4th ring. I heard, he said. No greeting. How? Reed. A pause. He called me 20 minutes ago. Of course he had. That was Reed. That had always been Reed. Carl, Grayson said. Don't, Brewster said. I said don't. The voice was rough. Don't ask me. Don't do the thing where you ask me formally so I can formally answer. Just a long exhale. Monday morning. What time? Grayson closed his eyes once, opened them. 8. I'll be there at 7:30, Brewster said. And Grayson. A pause that held something he didn't usually show. I've got a brother who does family court. Good one. I'll call him tonight. Grayson stood in the frozen parking lot and said nothing for a moment. Then, thank you, Carl. Don't thank me, Brewster said. Just win. He went back inside. Mason was still at the workbench. The calculator was done. He'd arranged all the completed repairs in a precise row on the far end of the bench. The clock, the radio, the walkie-talkies, the calculator. lined up with the specific orderliness of someone who needed the world around him to reflect that broken things could be made whole. He was sitting on the stool now, with nothing in his hands, looking at the row. Grayson sat beside him. "Big day Monday," Mason said. Not a question. "Yeah. Am I going to be there?" Grayson thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "You shouldn't be. I want to be." "I know." Grayson looked at the row of repaired things. Sometimes the best thing you can do in a fight is let the people who know how to fight it do their job. Mason was quiet. He picked up the pocket knife from the bench beside him. He'd had it in reach all afternoon, and turned it over once and set it back. "He's never met me," he said. "This Nash person. He doesn't know anything about me." "No." "Then why does he want me?" The question was the most precise articulation of the situation that anyone had offered all afternoon. Grayson looked at the boy. "Because you're connected to things he wants," he said. "Property, estate, legal standing. It's not about you." Mason looked at him. "Then he's going to lose," he said, "because everyone here is about me." The door of the clubhouse opened. Naomi came out of the back room. She had her phone in her hand and her attorney's voice was audible, tinny and fast, from the speaker. She looked at Grayson. He looked at her. Something passed between them. The specific understanding of two people who were going to be in a courtroom together on Monday morning, betting everything on the argument that love and loyalty and a child who could fix broken things in a room full of scarred veterans constituted family. And that family was the thing that mattered when courts tried to reduce everything to bloodline and legal standing and the clean, frightened language of people who'd never sat on a garage floor teaching a 10-year-old how a carburetor worked. The clock on the bar struck 6. Reed came in from outside, cold off his jacket, and looked at the room and said, "Brewster's brother is in. He's filing a counter motion tonight. The jukebox, the one Mason had fixed, the one that had been silent for 3 days before his hands found the right capacitors, clicked on. Nobody had fed it a quarter. The electrical system was temperamental, always had been, and sometimes it made its own decisions about when music was necessary. It played low. Something old. Steel guitar and a voice that had earned every line it carried. Mason looked at the jukebox. Then he looked at Grayson, and there was something in his face that was not quite a smile, and was not quite fear, and was the specific expression of someone standing at the edge of the largest thing they'd ever been asked to cross, looking at the person they'd decided to trust with the crossing. "Monday," he said. "Monday," Grayson said. Outside in the dark parking lot, 8 motorcycles sat in a row under the security light, chrome cold, exhaust pipes cooling, fuel in their tanks and miles in their engines, and every one of them ready to move the moment their riders decided the moment had come. And the moment was. Monday came in cold and clear, the kind of cold that had no ambiguity in it, the temperature that arrived after the gray weeks and announced itself as the real thing, the winter that meant business. The courthouse parking lot at 7:45 held 8 motorcycles in a row, parked with the precision of a formation that had been maintained in worse conditions than a family court Monday morning. Exhaust cooling in the frozen air, chrome catching the first pale sun. Brewster's brother was named Daniel, and he was nothing like Carl. He was lean and quiet, and wore a dark suit with a veteran's pin on the lapel that he did not draw attention to, and he had appeared before Judge Harold Cass 14 times and won 11 of them. He'd spent Saturday and Sunday building a countermotion that cited the will, the named guardianship, the documented weeks of stable placement, and the sworn statements of 9 men and 1 woman who had watched a traumatized child repair broken things and fall asleep on a bench in a room full of scarred veterans who had not once looked at him as anything other than someone worth protecting. Leonard Nash's attorney was good. Grayson would give him that. Kenneth Ferris stood before Judge Cass with the practiced ease of a man who'd converted resources into outcomes before and believed this was the same transaction. He used the phrase outlaw organization twice. He cited 3 news articles about motorcycle clubs in other states that had no relationship to the Iron Shepherds. He used the word environment the way people used it when they meant something else and wanted the record to reflect the something else without having to say it directly. Daniel Brewster objected, calmly. with precise legal language and the particular confidence of someone who had done his homework at the level of a man who considered homework a form of respect for the people he represented. And then Marcus Hale took the stand. He wore a collared shirt, and his hands were folded on the railing, and he looked at the judge with the expression he presumably used when explaining shop safety to 14-year-olds, which was to say the expression of a man who had long ago stopped caring whether he appeared impressive and had started caring only whether he was understood. He fixed a carburetor in 11 minutes, Marcus said. I've been a mechanic for 30 years. I handed him tools and got out of his way. Terry Van testified that the boy had corrected her on a valve clearance issue and been right. Gil Reyes testified that his own children had never once looked at a room and understood it as quickly as Mason Brooks had, and that the quality of attention a child brought to a space told you everything about whether the space was safe. Paul Sims did not testify about his own custody case. He didn't need to. He testified about watching a boy choose a name for himself in a garage and the particular dignity of that choice, and his voice was steady the whole way through. Carl Brewster, who had voted no, who had said we are not a charity for strays, sat in the gallery and did not testify. He had made a different choice. He had spent Sunday making phone calls to veterans organizations, community liaisons, and a county commissioner who owed him a favor from a veterans housing vote 3 years ago. And by Monday morning, the record that Daniel Brewster presented to Judge Cass included 14 letters of character and community standing for the Iron Shepherd MC, 2 of which were from law enforcement. Naomi Brooks testified last. She spoke about Caleb, about Lydia, about a letter written 2 weeks before a mountain road in November by a man who had watched a stranger stay when everyone else was looking the wrong direction and had written a name in an envelope and mailed it to himself so it would be waiting. Judge Harold Cass was not a warm man. He did not produce warmth from the bench. He produced something more durable than warmth, a considered, careful, expensive silence before his ruling, the silence of someone doing the actual work of deciding rather than performing the work of it. Leonard Nash sat in the gallery in a gray suit and did not look at his grandniece's son once during the entire proceeding. The ruling took 4 minutes to read. Naomi Brooks was confirmed as legal guardian. The emergency petition was denied. The court noted for the record that the placement environment had demonstrated by substantial documentation a level of community, stability, and child-centered attention that exceeded the petition's characterization in every material respect. Kenneth Ferris gathered his papers. He did not look at Grayson on his way out. Nash followed him without speaking to anyone. The courthouse hallway outside the courtroom was all marble and fluorescent light, and the specific acoustics of a public building that had heard too many difficult things to be surprised by any of them. Naomi came out with Daniel Brewster, and she put both hands over her face for a moment, and then took them away, and her eyes were wet, and her jaw was set, and she looked like someone who had just put down something very heavy and was learning what her arms felt like without it. Grayson stood with the brothers, and nobody made a speech. Reed put his hand once on Grayson's shoulder briefly and took it away. Hatch looked at the floor. Gil Reyes checked his phone and said he had to get his kids from school and left, and the leaving was its own kind of statement, the ordinary world pulling him back, which meant the ordinary world was still there, which was what they'd been fighting for. Brewster came and stood beside Grayson, said nothing for a moment. Then, Daniel says Nash can appeal. He can, Grayson said. Will he? Don't know. A pause. Probably not. The record's too clean now. Brewster looked at the marble floor. If he does, he said, call Daniel first, then call me. Grayson looked at him. Brewster met the look. I voted no, he said. I had my reasons. They were real reasons. A pause. And I was wrong about the part that mattered. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need to. Mason was not at the courthouse. He was at the clubhouse with Marcus, who had stayed with him, and when Grayson and Naomi came through the door at noon, the boy was at the bar, with a cup of hot chocolate Marcus had found somewhere, and a small engine component he was examining with a flashlight, and he looked up when they came in, and he read their faces the way he read everything, completely, immediately, without flinching. He set the component down. Okay? He said. Okay, Naomi said. He looked at Grayson. You okay? Yeah, Grayson said. I'm okay. Mason picked the component back up. Marcus says this crankshaft has a stress fracture, he said. He says it's not worth fixing, but I think it is. Marcus, at the bar. I said it wasn't worth my time. I didn't say it wasn't worth fixing. The distinction clearly pleased Mason. He bent back over the component with the flashlight. Grayson sat at the bar. Marcus poured coffee without being asked and set it down and went to look over Mason's shoulder and offered an opinion about the fracture that Mason immediately disputed with specific technical language that made Marcus make the sound he made when he was trying not to look impressed. Naomi sat beside Grayson. She wrapped both hands around the coffee Marcus had also poured for her without asking, and she looked at her nephew under the warm light of the hanging pendants, bent over a crankshaft at a biker clubhouse bar with a flashlight in one hand and absolute focus in his face, and she said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, Caleb would have loved this place. Grayson drank his coffee. Lydia would have cried the whole way home and then come back the next day, she said. He looked at her. When do you have to be back in Kansas? I'm a teacher, she said. I have some time. A pause. And Ethan needs to not be moved again too fast. His therapist says, she stopped. We found a therapist. She does trauma work with kids. She said stability of environment is the first priority. She looked at Grayson. She said the fact that he chose a name for himself and used it consistently is actually a significant positive marker, that it shows self-advocacy, agency. A small, complicated expression crossed her face. I told her he named himself after a bricklayer. She said that tracks. Grayson looked at Mason. The boy had set down the flashlight and was explaining something to Marcus with both hands, a gesture that described a mechanical rotation, his face lit with the specific animation of someone in the middle of a problem they loved. Outside, the winter afternoon was declining toward dark. The temperature was dropping again. The motorcycles in the lot were cold chrome under a paling sky. And somewhere on the county road a truck was moving away, its sound fading to nothing in the distance, and then there was just the clubhouse, and the clock, and the coffee, and the boy's voice explaining to a 61-year-old mechanic why a thing everyone said was not worth fixing was, in fact, worth fixing. Grayson set his mug down. He reached into his jacket pocket. He'd carried it since Saturday, a thing he'd found in the garage at home, in the drawer where he kept small parts and forgotten objects, a thing he'd picked up and held and decided to keep close until the right moment. He set it on the bar in front of Mason without ceremony, without explanation. A small brass gear, old, precise, the kind used in quality clockwork. Mason looked at it, picked it up, turned it over once in his careful hands. Spare, he said. Found it, Grayson said. Seemed like yours. Mason looked at him. Then he closed his hand around the gear and held it, and he didn't say anything, and the clock on the bar ticked, and the jukebox started playing something on its own the way it did sometimes, low and unhurried, the sound of something old and honest filling a room that had been built for exactly this, for people who'd been broken by the road to sit down together in the warm and remember that broken and finished were not the same thing. Not even close.